Good evening and welcome to this Prairie Lights virtual event. I'm Karen with Prairie Lights, and tonight I'm very excited to introduce Celia Stahr, who will be giving a talk on her new book, Frida in America. Frida in America was named one of the 7 books to read in March by Fortune and one of the 5 books to look forward to in 2020 by Jamie Herndon at the Wolfer. Publishers Weekly has called the book an insightful debut, featuring meticulous research and elegant turns of phrase. Stahr's engrossing account provides scholarly, though accessible analysis for both feminists and art lovers. Celia Stahr is a professor at the University of San Francisco, where she specializes in modern American and contemporary art with an emphasis on feminist art and gender studies, as well as African and multicultural art. She holds a doctorate in art history from the University of Iowa and lives in the Bay Area. So in just a moment, I'm going to turn the virtual floor over to her. But before I do, I just want to mention that at the end of the talk, we'll be opening things up for questions. So if you're new to Zoom, you'll notice at the bottom of the screen, there's a little Q&A button. At any time during tonight's event, please click that there and type your questions into the chat. And at the end, we'll be able to get to some of those questions. Frida in America is available at Prairie Lights. You can give us a call at 1-800-295-BOOK or hop online to order for free local delivery or curbside pickup. We're also shipping to anywhere in the continental US, and any media mail orders over $50 will ship for free. So thank you so much to you all for being here. Please welcome Celia Stahr.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you, Prairie Lights, for being able to adapt to our new COVID world. I'm sad that I can't be there in person. As you said, I got my doctorate in art history at the University of Iowa. And so I was looking forward to coming to Iowa City, getting to see some friends, professors, and of course, coming to Prairie Lights, a bookstore that I went to a lot. So I'm excited still to be here virtually with everybody tonight. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. So I want to start with my slides. Porfirio Diaz looks in the mirror and sees his brown mestizo skin. He picks up a powder puff dusted in white and begins to cover his indigenous Mixtec ancestry. For 31 years, this military general led Mexico masquerading as a light-skinned Spanish man because he wanted to make his country over into a Europe of the New World. By 1910, this ideal that had permeated the social fabric of Mexican society began to unravel with the outbreak of revolution. 20 years later, while in San Francisco, the artist Frida Kahlo looks in the mirror and sees her light brown skin. She's thankful she didn't end up with her father's German complexion, commenting, "I remember the color of my father's skin, that I did not like it," end quote. She's happy to see her mother's darker skin and powerful deep-set eyes accented by her maternal grandmother's conjoined eyebrows. She parts her black hair down the middle and pulls it back into a low bun. She applies lipstick, places Aztec-inspired earrings in her earlobes, and clasps an Aztec jadeite necklace around her neck. Then, over her long peasant-style skirt and blouse, she wraps her shoulders with a rebozo, that ubiquitous shawl symbolizing Mexican women of all classes. But the way she crosses the shawl over her shoulders creates the look of a soldadera, a revolutionary female soldier who wore bullet-filled bandoliers crossed in front. Sometimes, when not in uniform, soldaderas wore their rebozos crossed in front to distinguish themselves as soldiers. They played a crucial role in the revolution, and their fame grew as the popular corrido La Adelita about a soldadera who fought for Francisco Madero's troops came to symbolize the revolutionary spirit. After the revolution, the name Adelita became synonymous with any woman who fought for her rights. Frida identified with Adelita and the soldaderas, and while at a Mexican restaurant in San Francisco, she belted out the song La Adelita, proclaiming to her mother, quote, "I was a hit." Frida knew when she posed for Imogene Cunningham that by arranging her rebozo in a similar fashion to the soldaderas and wearing Aztec-inspired jewelry, that she evoked the persona of the politically engaged Mexican nationalist. For Frida, who was still coming into her own as a 23-year-old woman, that identity was bound up with the image of the strong, independent, and at times cross-dressing soldaderas. Frida would soon start creating self-portraits that foregrounded her strength as well. This is what struck me the first time I saw a self-portrait with Monkey from 1940. A fierce warrior with black hair pulled back tightly, showing off a prominent forehead, akin to an Aztec warrior, and a bird-like unibrow above intense brown eyes. A black spider monkey perched on her shoulder places its paw around this warrior's neck in a protective yet menacing pose that has the potential to strangle her as it clutches a red ribbon that loops around her neck and the monkey's. Yet Frida, the warrior, doesn't look fearful. This woman radiates power. She's proud of her brown skin and jet black eyebrows, as well as her facial hair just above and below her lips. Standing in front of a dense field of dark green leaves, her red hair ribbon and yellow shirt position her as a very different kind of woman in nature, a theme I'd seen previously in art, but which looked different. Frida doesn't stand nude in nature with an ethereal look on her face. She doesn't lie nude out in nature. Nor does she have a mask-like face, as in Paula Modersohn-Becker's self-portrait with Amber Necklace. In some ways, she has the strong gaze and connection to nature of Leonardo's Mona Lisa. But Frida makes her connection to nature even stronger with the integration of the leaves, the monkey, and the warrior. Just look into the eyes of the warrior and the monkey. They are one and the same. They command this painting. At the time I encountered this image, I was an undergraduate college student at San Francisco State, sitting in one of my first art history classes, and I had never heard of Frida Kahlo. I had just returned from a 3.5-month trip to East Africa, and before that, a trip to Mexico, and I was questioning what to do with my life. In that darkened art history lecture hall, when Professor Whitney Chadwick clicked the slide projector to advance to this painting of a fierce woman and her spider monkey, all the cliches you can imagine happened at once. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't stop staring. I had to know who made this painting. I couldn't get this image of Frida out of my head, so I wrote my first art history paper on this then little-known Mexican painter. At the time, Hayden Herrera had recently published her groundbreaking biography and was promoting it by making the rounds on college campuses and in bookstores. I was overjoyed when I saw she was coming to San Francisco. The more I learned about Frida, the more I wanted to know. I became immersed in my research for this art history paper and in the world of Frida. Just as traveling to East Africa and Mexico had opened me up to new ways of seeing the world, Frida Kahlo's self-portrait with Monkey helped to change my path in life. I decided to study art history in graduate school. As most of you are probably aware, throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Frida's popularity grew as more and more people discovered the incredible art and life of this Mexican woman who was a trailblazer in so many ways. She was a radical in the 1930s and 1940s because she defied gender and racial stereotypes, both in her life and in her paintings. More and more books and articles were written, exhibitions were mounted, movies were made, and the merchandise kept coming. By the end of the 1990s, Frida had become famous, and I had begun to focus on other artists. I never stopped loving Frida's paintings. I just tucked her away while working on my PhD. But Frida wouldn't let go of me. In 2007, now teaching at the University of San Francisco, I had the opportunity to present a paper for a conference that featured women artists working between the two world wars. As I pondered which artists I'd like to focus on, I realized that all the artists I'd ever read about from the interwar period were white Europeans. My interest had always been cross-cultural, so I thought Frida would be a fascinating artist because she was Mexican, yet she was living in the United States between 1930 and 1933, a period that was instrumental in her development as an artist and the creation of her persona as a provocateur. Certainly scholars had discussed her important breakthrough paintings while in Detroit, such as Henry Ford Hospital, seen on the left, and My Birth, seen on the right. But a fuller understanding of her creative process, which led to these breakthroughs, and her complex reactions to what she experienced in San Francisco, Detroit, and New York were missing. We knew a lot about her mature style, but not as much about her development as an artist. How did she get from two women, seen on the left, to the two Fridas 10 years later, seen on the right? Or how does she get from two women, seen on the left, to Portrait of Ava Frederick, seen on the right? Or Portrait of Jean White? How does she go from that to her portrait of Luther Burbank, created just 3 months later? Likewise, how does she go from self-portrait Time Flies, 1929, made in Mexico shortly before coming to the United States, and Henry Ford Hospital, 1932? Henry Ford Hospital is a very different depiction of herself. And so how did living in the United States, a place Frida experienced in a tumultuous period of the Depression era, impact her? Now, most would say she disliked Gringolandia, as she would call it. And this is true, but it's also too simplistic. Yes, she disliked aspects of the United States, hated the injustices she witnessed, but she also found San Francisco to be a beautiful city surrounded by water. She marveled at Chinatown. She loved the Metropolitan Museum in New York, got a kick out of American movies and actresses such as Mae West or actors such as Charlie Chaplin. Even in Detroit, the city that she liked the least, she did say she found the industries there interesting. So I wanted to understand more fully what it was that Frida disliked and what it was that she liked. What had the most impact, either in a positive or a negative manner? Now, when discussing Frida's time in the United States, understandably, scholars tend to focus on these two breakthrough paintings because they foreground Frida's physical and emotional pain, a subject that's emphasized in the literature on the artist. But she also created two of her most politically charged paintings: Self-Portrait on the Borderline Between Mexico and the United States, seen on the left, created in Detroit in 1932, and My Dress Hangs There, created in New York in 1933. But these paintings are filled with images that are difficult to decipher in a reproduction. There are many objects in them that I noticed, certainly in reproductions, but when I got to see them in person, I really started to notice even more. For example, in My Dress Hangs There, I saw in person that she, takes these newspaper clippings and collages them and puts them in the foreground of her painting, seen right here. And I knew that they were there before I saw them in person. However, as I got much closer, I could see what the signs said, or at least some of them. And this area right here, which I tried to create a close-up for you, but you can see it gets blurry. But in person, I could see it, of course, much clearer. And there were three signs that really stood out to me in this particular area. One says, "Smash Scottsboro Frame Up." Another says, "Negro White on the Picket Lines." And a third says, "Negro White Workers." And I was just absolutely taken with these. I thought, why did she include these signs? Again, they're taken from newspapers, so obviously she's making a creative choice, right? She's choosing particular photographs, imagery, and cuts them out and then collages them into her painting. What's also significant here is that in one case, a Black man holds the sign, "Negro White on Picket Line," and in the other case, a white woman holds the sign, "Negro White Workers." Clearly, the emphasis is upon Black and white workers united in their call for better wages, job security, and racial justice. I wondered if Frida had experienced any of the protests in the streets of New York. Did she have direct experience, or was she an observer who had only experienced them by reading the newspaper. And also I wondered, why hadn't any other scholar that I'd read discussed these particular images? Well, I began to do some research into this period of the early 1930s, and I learned that the Communist Party of the United States was promoting unity between Black and white workers. Under the party's legal arm, called the International Labor Defense, they hired New York criminal defense attorney Samuel Leibowitz for the appeals of 9 African-American youths, referred to as the Scottsboro Boys. These 9 youths, ranging in age from 19 to 12, had been unjustly accused of raping 2 white women in Alabama. And this was toward the end of March in 1931. At their first trial, it was a hung jury, but Judge Hawkins declared a mistrial and sentenced 8 of the 9 to the electric chair. By November of 1932, the US Supreme Court reversed the convictions due to the Alabama court's failure to provide the youths with adequate legal counsel. It's at this point that Samuel Leibowitz takes over the cases. And so in January of 1933, when the first appeals case for Haywood Patterson commenced, his chances of being found innocent were promising due to his new lawyer and one of the women, Ruby Bates, recanting her rape accusation. Yet in April of 1933, once again, an all-white jury found Patterson guilty, sentencing him to death. On April 9th, an outraged public took to the streets in Harlem, and then again on April 25th, and on May Day in New York City's Union Square, and in Washington, D.C. on May 8th in 1933, led by Haywood Patterson's mother, Janie Patterson. Tensions were so high at this time that the judge presiding over the remaining cases of the Scottsboro Boys were postponed. I soon realized that the high-profile Scottsboro case, combined with the Communist Party's sponsorship of legal services, their sponsorship of marches, their sponsorship of the signing and distributing of petitions to free the African-American youths, was very important to Frida's experience while living in the United States. She'd been in San Francisco when the Scottsboro case began in March of 1931, and she was in New York during one of its most heated periods in 1933. She not only would have known about the call for racial and class justice through the newspapers, but she and her husband, muralist Diego Rivera, were caught up in the energy of protest. Diego had begun working on his mural for the new RCA building in Rockefeller Plaza on April 2nd. Frida wrote on the back of her painting, "My Dress Hangs There," that she began painting it while Diego was painting his Man at the Crossroads at Rockefeller Plaza. Both were creating during this tense time, and both include images of protest and images of Black men. In Diego's mural, on the left lower right, in this area here, which I tried to create a close-up of, again, it's a bit blurry, but what we see are a police officer on horseback with his baton raised with protesters underneath him. And the signs for these protesters say, "Want work, not charity," and "Divided we starve, united we eat." On the right side of the mural, over here in this area, Diego emphasizes justice for all with a soldier, a white worker, Vladimir Lenin, and a Black male worker, all holding hands, seen here in this close-up. Diego, by including the Black man here, he took a Black man who was reviled in American society and made him a figure of unity in the communist Soviet Union. It would not be long before Diego's inclusion of Lenin, a Russian communist revolutionary and theorist, would be cause for a controversy. On May 4th, Nelson Rockefeller asked Diego to remove Lenin's face from the mural, and Diego refused, in part because his mural assistants, led by Ben Shahn, had signed a protest letter threatening to quit if he succumbed to the pressure. Ultimately, Diego was paid in full, but was asked to leave on May 9th, and the mural, which was close to completion, was ultimately destroyed. This prompted more protests in New York City, seen here. But before the protests of the destruction of Diego's mural came to pass in late May, first we had the Nazi book burnings on May 10th, just one day after Diego's mural commission was canceled. In 34 towns, university students throughout Germany threw their books by authors such as Bertolt Brecht, Ernst Hemingway, and Helen Keller into fire pits to, quote, cleanse the German spirit, end quote. The American Jewish Congress had coordinated in advance huge nationwide demonstrations. A crowd estimated at 80 to 100,000 marched through the streets of New York City for approximately 6 hours. You could say that New York City in 1933 was consumed with protest marches, protesting the huge wealth gap in a capitalist system made more prominent by the economic depression, protesting the inequities of a racist legal system, protesting the rise of Nazism with its anti-Semitic government policies and intensive propaganda program, protesting the suppression of the freedom of expression. After having a fuller understanding of this history, the newspaper clippings of marches collaged in the foreground of Frida's painting became much more than a generalized sign of the times. They made me feel the anguish, the pain, the frustration, and fear in this tumultuous period, as well as the elation of unity in the face of grave dangers and dire outcomes. And yes, sadly, history does repeat itself, but maybe today we'll actually get it right. In Frida's painting, Lady Liberty stands in the background, her arm held high. We have independent Mae West in the left middle ground. And then we see Frida's Tewana dress hanging in the center foreground, hovering above the protesters. Perhaps Frida is saying that it's time for women to have real political and economic power. Frida's political painting and Diego's political mural were not isolated works of art that expressed such social and political issues. Frida was surrounded by artists who were galvanized by the Scottsboro legal battle that went on for years. Here we see Hugo Gellert's illustration for the Marxist periodical New Masses, which shows the inhumane treatment of the Scottsboro boys. Below in the caption, Gellert also laments the desire on the part of many in the public to see these teens quickly executed. Hideo Noda, one of Diego's mural assistants, also made this gouache on the left, showing Haywood Patterson standing in this surrealist-inspired space where the scale of the figures and objects are cut off, creating a disorienting feeling, and where odd-looking heads or masks lie on newspapers in the right bottom foreground, with one stating, "Scottsboro boy must not die." Likewise, Isamu Noguchi expressed his anger over the unjust treatment of the Scottsboro boys and of the lynching of African Americans in general. In 1934, when Noguchi made this sculpture, the anti-lynching legislation called the Costigan-Wagner Bill failed to pass, prompting many protest signs with lynched figures and artists' works addressing what was viewed as another example of a racist system. Frida had seen the Jim Crow system of segregation firsthand. When a year before she painted My Dress Hangs There, she'd actually stopped in Little Rock, Arkansas with her friend and fellow artist, Lucienne Bloch. As the two were walking through the train station, they saw a sign that stated "For Negroes," indicating the separate area for boarding. According to Bloch's granddaughter, Lucienne Allen, quote, "Frida insisted my grandmother take this picture of her because they were both angered by such blatant racism, end quote. In Lucienne Bloch's journal, she wrote of this experience, quote, "It is like being in another world to see such outrageous medievalism," end quote. In 2008, when I first saw this photograph, I'd never seen it before, and I'd never read anything about it. But it became one of several threads I pulled together to better understand Frida's experiences with racism while in the United States, and her use of protest imagery in My Dress Hangs There. It also helped me to understand more deeply her depiction of a beautiful African-American woman with an active gaze, as seen here in Portrait of Ava Frederick, created in San Francisco. Nothing of substance had been written about this portrait. I had my work cut out for me. I also wanted to know more about Self-Portrait on the Borderline between Mexico and the United States, again created in 1932 while she was in Detroit. It became the focal point for the talk that I gave at for the conference on women working between the two wars. It's a complex painting with a lot of imagery to absorb. A smoke belching Ford factory, high rises and machines occupying the right side, and the ruins of a pyramid, a crumbling wall, a skull, two ceramic figurines, flowers, and cacti occupying the left. In the middle on a border marker stands Frida with perfect posture. She wears a colonial style floor-length pastel pink dress with fitted bodice. While it's easy to get lost in all of the images in this painting, details matter. This proper-looking young woman becomes a provocateur when you notice her tight-fitting bodice and visible nipples. Her obvious bralessness would have raised eyebrows among the Detroit area's upper crust. But Frida doesn't look ashamed. She stands tall as an independent Mexican woman, symbolized by the lit cigarette in one hand and the paper Mexican flag in the other. She also stands tall as a mestiza, a woman of mixed ethnicities, wearing a colonial-style dress and a beaded necklace bearing the colors of the Mexican flag. It's a hybrid outfit, and it's appropriate, as scholar Gloria Anzaldúa observes, quote, "The Mexico-United States border is a site where many different cultures touch each other, and the permeable, flexible, and ambiguous shifting grounds lend themselves to hybrid images," end quote. Frida plays up her hybridity through her outfit and her connection to both sides of the border. She also plays up her strong gaze, something she had been perfecting as an adolescent, seen here on the far left in this photograph. And it's something that she will continue to perfect in her painted self-portraits as she matures, as seen on the far right in this self-portrait from 1940. Actually, her gaze becomes even stronger in the self-portrait she created, seen in the center in the United States in 1933. So back in 2007, I had many unanswered questions about this painting, Self-Portrait on the Borderline. I wanted to know more about the symbolism and the context in which it was created. I wanted to know what was Frida's experience of the US-Mexico border, given the anti-Mexican feeling and the forced deportation of approximately 1.8 million Mexicans in the 1930s. I wanted to know more about the objects in the painting. Is the pyramid on the left a reference to the Mexica, better known as the Aztecs? It shows two stairways indicating it's Aztec, but would Frida have been familiar with Aztec pyramids in this period when Mexico was just beginning to uncover so many of its ruins that had been destroyed by the conquistadors? Why does Frida place the American flag in the smoke of Ford industry? What did she think of Henry Ford and the River Rouge plant? What was happening with Ford workers around the time she was making the painting? I found out, for example, that on New Year's Day in 1933, Ford cut employees' wages for the second time in 3 years, prompting 9,000 workers to go on strike. A little over a month later, a reproduction of Frida's painting was shown in the February Detroit News article called "Wife of Master Mural Painter Gleefully Dabbles in Works of Art." While journalist Florence Davies belittles Frida's talent as an artist with her choice of words "gleefully dabbles" in the title, she conceded in the article that Frida's painting is by no means a joke. And this becomes apparent when comparing it to other US artists like Charles Sheeler's American Landscape, which glorifies Ford's River Rouge factory. I also had questions about a trip Frida took by train to Mexico with her friend and fellow artist Lucienne Bloch in September of 1932. Frida had just begun this painting when she received word that her mother was ill. She left for Mexico, and after she returned to Detroit a month and a half later, she completed this painting, Self-Portrait on the Borderline. Significantly, at this point, she had crossed the border twice and then finished the painting. I wanted to know again, what kind of experiences did she have crossing over the border at this very tumultuous time? And thankfully, Lucienne Bloch kept a journal, and I was allowed to make a copy of it. And so I could read through the journal very carefully, and she provided many answers to my questions. So in 2008, I continued working on my analysis of this painting. And then I had another symposium where I was able to talk about it in a bit more detail. This time, the symposium accompanied the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art's 2008 Frida exhibition. The theme of the symposium, an idea that Whitney Chadwick and I proposed, was to focus on the 3 US cities where Frida had been: San Francisco, Detroit, and New York. Whitney Chadwick discussed Frida in San Francisco, I discussed Frida in Detroit, and Hayden Herrera discussed Frida in New York. I felt as if I had come full circle from my early days of discovering Frida due to both Whitney Chadwick and Hayden Herrera. It was one of the high points of my career. I was also thrilled to meet and speak with art historian Victor Zamudio Taylor, who had contributed an essay to the Frida exhibition catalog, to artist Amalia Mesa Baines, and to curator-scholar Terry Romero. They had been symposium respondents, and the conversations with all 3, both on stage and in private, made me realize that many of the questions I had about Frida's artistic sources and her creative development, both before coming to the United States and while she was in the United States, didn't have clear answers, or any at all. I needed to conduct a lot more research. In the weeks after the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art Symposium, a feeling grew inside of me that I needed to write the book I wanted to read. I envisioned a book for a general audience detailing Frida's personal and creative journey while living in the United States from 1930 to 1933. I wanted to write a story, not a scholarly essay or book, but a story that would be well-researched and factual, yet written in a style that would allow readers to feel as if they were on this journey with Frida. As the documentary filmmaker Ken Burns put it, history is mostly story. For it is the great storytelling tradition found in most cultures and time periods that allows us to understand complex information in a manner that sticks because we feel something. Perhaps writer Maya Angelou says it best. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. My hope is that this cross-cultural journey will inspire people to think about Frida in new and profound ways, to understand her more fully as a complex, brilliant woman who in her early 20s struggled to find her own voice as an artist and person, but who ultimately broke through to a signature style that she would build upon for the rest of her career. I believe that Frida had everything inside of her that she needed to produce a major breakthrough in her art before coming to the United States. However, experiencing both her own personal turmoil and the United States' political and social turmoil created a combustible energy that produced artworks such as Portrait of Luther Burbank, Henry Ford Hospital, My Birth, Self-Portrait on the Borderline Between Mexico and the United States, and My Dress Hangs There. As one of Frida's favorite authors, D.H. Lawrence, put it, quote, "All art partakes of the spirit of place in which it is produced," end quote. This place happened to be the United States. And so the word America in the title references Frida's time in the United States of America. But because this is a story about a Mexican artist, it's an America seen through Frida's eyes. She brings a very different and complicated perspective to what we call in this country the American experience. For her, America is both the United States and Latin America. It is the problematic North American border relationship between Mexico and the United States. And it is the promise of Pan-Americanism, which was taken up by artists, intellectuals, and social activists in the 1930s, including Diego Rivera. Frida is an icon today, but in her role as a beloved icon, as scholar Margaret Lindauer has observed, quote, Kahlo became synonymous with a look rather than with her creative production, end quote. That is, Frida's look is more well known than the contents and the interpretations of her paintings. To this end, in tracing her creative process, I wanted to look closely at the paintings. I thought it would be incredible if I could somehow discuss the paintings in a way that allowed readers to step into them as if they were rooms. Instead of looking at a work of art from a distance, as one might in a gallery or museum, I thought if I could create a greater intimacy between Frida's paintings and readers, then people might gain a deeper understanding of her creative process and the multiple layers of her often profound works of art, layers that derive from hybrid images, Catholic, Aztec, colonial, modern, Mexican cultural traditions, subjects from the United States, etc. Likewise, in the epilogue, I wanted to give some sense of how the new breakthrough paintings created in the United States affected her later work. Here we can see how the use of blood and red strings were first used in her paintings in the United States. But these two symbols, as well as the heart, become more prevalent in her work after she returns to Mexico in 1933. Now, in going back to the prologue, I wrote the prologue in order to emphasize the significance of blood, the significance of the heart, and the significance of Aztec traditions for Frida. And so I'd like to end my talk tonight by just reading that prologue to you. The Aztec sun god Huitzilopochtli threw a rebel's heart into Lake Texcoco and proclaimed, "When you see an eagle perched on a cactus holding a snake in its mouth, this is where you shall build your city." Aztec Myth. Frida was lying in a blood-soaked bed. Small creases in the white cotton sheets had absorbed the red liquid like the fruit of a prickly pear cactus sliced open. Glistening magenta, fruit of the earth, the blood miracle that consecrated the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, now surrounded Frida's naked body with the pain of death. The eagle and snake were missing in the dark early morning hours, but the sun still came up, casting light on Frida's dark, damp hair covered with salty tears. She wailed in agony and despair. Diego, frantic, didn't know what to do. The blood, the screaming, it was all too much for him. He rushed into the living room, muttering something about the doctor. A call was made, but Frida would have to suffer for another hour before an ambulance arrived. At the Henry Ford Hospital, Frida, recumbent on a gurney, was whisked through the long, narrow cement hallway in the basement, her eyes fixed on what she perceived to be multicolored pipes on the ceiling. "Look, Diego, que precioso, how beautiful," she exclaimed. This was the last bit of beauty Frida would encounter for a while. "We descend from death," Carlos Fuentes sings out. "Death smiles, dances, and provides the sweet caresses of a lover." The skeletons of Jose Guadalupe Posada fill the imagination, especially during Day of the Dead celebrations, embracing Mexicans with their origins, holding on to Aztec times. "The past is always present," Fuentes whispers. "The heart, center of the human body, is the axis mundi. Keep the universe in motion," the Aztecs proclaimed. "Feed the gods." Blood was the cuisine the gods favored. Blood creates a line from the earthly to the divine, from death to life, from darkness to light. The duality of life for the Aztecs, as for Frida, was a bringing together of opposites. "Everything is all in one," Frida wrote. Seating these opposites side by side to share the blood of death and life, she painstakingly stitched them together with paint, one small stroke at a time. Blood and the concept of duality became central for Frida's art and life while living in the United States. She was a child of the Mexican Revolution, as she liked to say, a passionate defender of the underdog. But it took living in the United States, a place she'd longed to visit since her teenage years, to shake her foundations of home and homeland, forcing her to see a different reality. She struggled and stumbled in this foreign country, cursing it at times, embracing it at others, but always she visualized it with a keen eye for the humor that bubbled under the surface of pain. Frida loved life. It came through in her infectious, throaty laugh and in her direct manner of speaking. Even in English, sometimes she'd exaggerate her Mexican accent when necessary to spice up the conversation or punctuate a point. It came through in her way of dressing, whether she was wearing a man's suit or a colorful peasant-style pleated skirt and top. Details mattered. The right Aztec-inspired earrings, the perfect length cane, the precise size of jadeite beads, the best shade of lipstick. Everything was done with love. "Love is the only reason for living," she proclaimed. Fuentes said Frida was, quote, "a natural pantheist, a woman and an artist involved in the glory of universal celebration, an explorer of the interrelatedness of all things, a priestess declaring everything created as sacred," end quote. When she came to the United States at 23 with her husband, muralist Diego Rivera, she was still at the beginning of this exploration, with eyes wide open, seeing how all things were interrelated and integrating this universal celebration into her art. The young Frida was a novice painter. Her husband, on the other hand, was 44 and at the height of his creative powers. When Time magazine ran a short article on Diego a year into his stay in the United States, it referred to Frida as, quote, "his pretty little Mexican wife, the former Frida Kahlo," end quote. Frida would always be physically petite, but her identity as Frida Kahlo, the great painter, grew in stature as she grew creatively and personally in the United States. Her first stop was San Francisco, a place she dreamt about for years. The day before Diego received the letter from the American architect Timothy Pfluger inviting him to paint a mural on the wall of his recently completed Pacific Stock Exchange building in San Francisco, Frida had her recurring dream. She saw herself waving goodbye to her family as she left her beloved Mexican homeland for San Francisco, the city of the world, as she called it. It amazed Diego that Frida's dream had been so prescient. Frida knew she had to start packing because she believed you had to, quote, "protect what destiny has given you," end quote. Thank you.
So yes, please send your questions into the Q&A box. The first one we have, the first question asks about your PhD topic. So can you talk a little bit more about the time when you were looking at other subjects other than Frida Kahlo and sort of what other artwork you were studying?
Sure. So I said in my talk that my background in many ways is cross-cultural because I first got interested in art history by taking an African art history class at San Francisco State. And the reason that I applied to the University of Iowa is because I was really drawn to African art and to modern art. And then I was particularly interested in how modern artists had used African art to inspire them, but oftentimes not even giving credit to the African artists or the art itself. And so the University of Iowa was known for its strong programs in both modern and in African art. Now, when I came to the University of Iowa, I was really studying French painting with Dr. Dorothy Johnson. I was studying modern art, and I was studying African art. And then I had to make this choice. And so, make a long story short, I decided to focus on art created in the United States, and really wanting to look at it though from a cross-cultural perspective, and also really interested in issues of gender. And so I ended up doing my doctoral dissertation on some of the artists associated with abstract expressionism, a mid-century movement that was really centered in New York City. And I was interested in why some artists were chosen to represent what we call the canon, and why others had been marginalized. I started out being very interested in Elaine de Kooning, and then I broadened it to look at also another artist, Hedda Stern, and then also Milton Resnick and Esteban Vicente. And I was looking at both then issues of race, ethnicity, and gender, and looking at how did that, well, first off, did that impact why they were not some of the canonized artists? And if so, why? And part of what I did was I actually tried to interview as many artists or people who were still around in that time period to get their perspectives on why some people were included and others not. And part of what I learned was that the artists themselves really looked at the importance of their community. And so a lot of it was also focused on community and the impact of place. And so in some ways, of course, there are these strands that connect what I did with my dissertation to the book that I wrote on Frida Kahlo. That is the importance of place. Also for the abstract expressionists, while they become famous in the late 40s and early 50s, the 1930s was a very important period for them. And so I had looked at that period already. And that was another reason I was drawn then to working on Frida in the United States in the 1930s, because I knew it was this very interesting and significant period for the history of this country, but also for artists.
Thank you, yeah. Next question is sort of about focusing your book on a very particular time period. I wonder, it sounds like that sort of became was sort of the incentive for writing the book, but I wonder if like different elements of her biography outside those 3 years, did you wind up feeling constrained by that limitation, or was it sort of a help to kind of keep it focused in those years?
For me, it was really a help. I mean, I didn't necessarily want to cover her whole life, since, I mean, Hayden Herrera had already done that. And I didn't really want to like rewrite a whole biography. I just, the thing that I found the most challenging though, was I knew it was important for readers to understand some things about Frida, of course, beyond just the 3 years she spent in the United States. I knew that I couldn't assume that a reader had a background in Frida Kahlo. You know, I mean, many will, but you know, many will not. And so I just had to figure out how was I going to incorporate some of her biography into those 3 years, and how was I going to show the time that she spent before coming to the United States, which I thought was so important to understanding her development. And so like in the beginning, when I was writing chapters, I tried to do these flashback scenes, and I was a part of a writing group at the time, and they would read it and they'd say, no, this doesn't work. This is confusing. And I said, okay, I gotta scrap this. And then I realized, and I guess I should also say, I didn't want to also start with those chapters because it's a book about Frida in the United States. So I didn't want to start with her, her life early on in Mexico. So then I finally realized, I'm like, well, I could start with one chapter, bring the reader into her time in the United States, and then go back in time with a chapter or two, and then re-enter the United States. And that seemed to work a lot better. And my writing group liked it much better. So that was really the biggest issue for me.
Yeah, thanks. The next question is about, do you know sort of what prompted Frida to choose the 3 locations in the US that she stayed in?
Yeah, it was decided upon by her husband, Diego Rivera, because he had these commissions to do murals throughout the United States. And so the first 2 murals were commissioned in San Francisco. Then actually they go back to Mexico briefly after San Francisco. Then he actually gets a retrospective, a museum show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And so then they go to New York in 1931 because of that. Then they go to Detroit in 1932 because he has a mural commission at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And I must say that those murals at the Detroit Institute of Arts are really magnificent. If you ever have a chance to go there, go see them. I was not prepared for how powerful they are. Part of it too is the location itself. It's an incredible location. There's light coming in through the ceiling, and you're surrounded by the murals in this courtyard, and they're really stunning. So they went there, and then they went back to New York because, as I talked about in the talk, he had a mural commission at Rockefeller Center.
The next question is, while in graduate school, did your activist side and experience with the Women's Resource and Action Center inform some of the questions that you examine in your own research?
Yes, definitely. While I was in Iowa City, yes, I was involved. I volunteered there, and I was also a part of a group called Women Against Racism. And it was comprised of both women of color and white women. And I found, both of these experiences to be incredibly powerful. In the Women Against Racism group, we talked about all of these very important but difficult conversations around race, around white privilege. I found that it really helped to educate me. It helped me, again, to not only understand things on an intellectual level, but to really feel things related to racism, to see the connections between racism and sexism, and homophobia, etc. Issues of class. And so, yeah, all of those experiences were really important to me, and certainly helped inform many of the questions, that I was looking at while working on this book. So, yes.
Thanks. So we have one more question. We can make this a last call. So if anyone has a last pressing question, please type it in now and we'll ask it before the end. But if not, the last question is, do you know, did the mural that Rivera was commissioned for in San Francisco, did that one survive, unlike the one at Rockefeller Center?
Yes, he ultimately he created 3 murals in San Francisco. So on the trip that he made in 1930, he created one at the Pacific Stock Exchange, and then also at the San Francisco Art Institute. Now, he came back to San Francisco in 1940, and he created another mural, Pan American Unity, which was made for the City College of San Francisco, and which is supposed to be the centerpiece of a major Diego Rivera retrospective or exhibition at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. It's supposed to open, I believe, around November, but who knows, we'll see, right, with our COVID world. But all of those murals are extant. However, I don't know what's happening at the San Francisco Art Institute, since they have had funding issues, and I think there's some talk around what to do with the mural, but they are all, extant.
Great. Okay, well, that was our last question. So thank you so much. This was really so lovely to listen to. The book is Frida in America. You can order it from Prairie Lights. And thank you so much to everyone for coming out.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks.